on an island because that's where I'm there. But we're always looking to branch out and to get into other states. We have a lot of membership support here in Illinois, so I was very excited to get the invite today and to talk about a project that has gone on for a couple years now and we think was very successful. There we are. We're good. Just some of the industry groups represented on our board here. So a lot of the pipe manufacturers belong to ADMC, the contracting organizations that are out there, as well as some the design firms that are in this space, and also the Drainage District Association. So Dick back there, always welcome to come on board too. But we also have support from Illinois, like Illinois corn growers, and so like I mentioned before, we would love to do more work here in Illinois. This Polk County Saturated Buffer project that I'm going to speak about today really was a team effort. I get to make a lot of presentations about it, so I get to brag about it a lot, but I do need to recognize the other partners that were very crucial to see this thing all the way through. We had great support from our Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. They funded much of the project. A lot of great leadership from Polk County. They were actually the fiscal agent for this project. We'll hear a little bit more about what that fiscal agent is. Polk Soil and Water Conservation District, very vital in this. Their watershed coordinator is kind of the point person on the ground for the project. And we also partnered with NRCS. It's actually interesting, none of these practices were funded by NRCS, but NRCS facilitated the designs of it, updated the conservation plans, very crucial in this partnership effort. And moving forward, we're actually incorporating NRCS funding into this model that I'll speak about today. Just at this time, we kind of had money already in place and we didn't want to wait around for batching dates. This is why we actually didn't try to apply for EQIP or any of the RCPP. Moving forward, we realized it's still about a year process on getting these things designed and actually implemented, so we can actually wait for these batching dates so it can be incorporated. Before I say Polk County model too many more times, just kind of hit some of the highlights of this project. In 2021, we were able to install 40 saturated buffers and 11 bioreactors in Polk County, and actually just a select couple of watersheds there by utilizing this model. And just for a little bit of kind of scale of impact, only 49 of these edge of field practices had been installed nationwide utilizing EQIP over a 5-year span. We were able to put 51 of these in the ground, about an 18-month effort. The state of Iowa has been doing quite a bit of work with these edge of field practices. So statewide, before 2021, there was probably 115 of these types of practices in the state. So we've kind of gone through a lot of the growing pains of trying to figure out the engineering on it, getting people signed up, how to get through the programs. With that said, going from 115 to 160 some in a year, we're showing really good progress on it, and we're very, very excited about it. We think this new model, we saved about $115,000, we estimated, compared to kind of the traditional install by doing it just one at a time. We really want to hit this economies of scale with it. We were able to do that with this fiscal agent model, where we actually had landowners sign an agreement with the fiscal agents. In this case, it was the county itself. And the county managed the contractor, all the payments. So no payment, no invoice ever got sent to a landowner. All the invoices got sent to the fiscal agent. The fiscal agent had the agreement with all the funders to pay out and manage that contractor. And we think what we have set up is repeatable. We're actually doing this quite a bit now in Iowa. There's probably 5 other batch and builds going on right now in the state. We think we're going to be seeing 200 to 300 of these practices going in every year here moving forward. Here's just that slide that we see at the Conservation Drainage Network meeting every year. NRCS kind of gives an update on a number of these practices, and I just show it. It's not that these practices are bad. I just think our delivery mechanism of these could be improved. If we could improve the way we get these things out to the farmers, market it to the farmers, I think we can actually start putting more of these in the ground. But obviously, only 49 over 5 years isn't going to get us to our nutrient reduction goals, and so we really wanted to figure out how to move the needle on this. Also, before I go any further, in case people aren't familiar with saturated buffers or bioreactors, top picture there is just a diagram of a wood chip bioreactor. Both these practices are aimed at removing nitrogen from the system. They don't really do a whole lot with phosphorus, so it is a nitrate removal practice. Both of these, we basically tap in to a tile main and divert a portion of that flow through a different carbon source. So the bioreactor, it's a pit of wood chips, about 100 feet long, 25 feet wide on average. Saturated buffer is actually that carbon source of that soil organic matter near the stream. So if there's a 30-foot wide filter strip in place and the soils are tightened up, we're not just going to lose it out the bottom, we'll put a saturated buffer in there to remove that nitrogen. Historically in Polk County, a couple different funding mechanisms, and this is pretty common, I guess, in our state. It's probably similar to what you guys have going on in your watershed. There's some state funding with the water quality initiative that we have in Iowa as part of our nutrient reduction strategy. And there is the EQIP funding mechanism through NRCS, and also CRP on FSA side can actually fund these saturated buffers and bioreactors. Utilizing this traditional cost share model, they went through the full conservation planning historically. So speaking with the watershed coordinator, we're asked, well, why do you think this is taking so long to get these practices out there? And the feedback from the coordinator was, well, they were going out to the farms, meeting with the landowners, and they were kind of overwhelmed. It was like going to the Cheesecake Factory almost, with a big menu full of different practices they could select. By the time they got through that whole list of practices, it's just a little overwhelming, and just not a lot of action would occur, or they might select a practice that they're just more familiar with than these edge of field practices. And also it's very opportunity based, who's showing up to a field day, was an interested farmer that might have a spot that would work. Maybe they would install one of these practices, or somebody comes into the office, but it wasn't really an aggressive marketing campaign to get these practices out there. With that said, they did treat 6 outlets. So they had 6 of these sites put in 2015 through 2019, which, historically, if you look at a lot of other counties, that's probably more than a lot of the other counties. Looking at their watershed plans, they had plans calling for 100 of these practices. So they knew, well, we're only doing 1 year. That's going to take a long time to get to our goals. So we sat down with them, had conversations about, well, what do we think these barriers are, and what can we do to try to get over these barriers? And so, like I mentioned before, outlets were just lost in that conversation about conservation practices. So other practices would kind of take priority in the landowner farmer's mind, go straight to cover crops, or a tillage program, which are very important practices in their own right. But a lot of times we wouldn't get to, all right, well, what about these edge of field practices that can work with your system too? No matter the cost share that we had lined up for the farmer, there's still a lot of hassle to that landowner. The biggest thing being, they be in charge of hiring the contractor to go out there and do that work, waiting for those funding cycles to come up, kind of having that pressure of, all right, is my funding going to be there when my contractor can be there? Do those line up right? Will I be able to pay right away? Also, at least in Iowa, the farmer, you have to get an invoice from the contractor. They have to pay the contractor out, then show proof of payment, then get reimbursed whatever funding mechanism they had, which is a lot of upfront costs when we're talking structural practices. And also, we thought deterred people from installing multiple practices, especially these edge of field practices. They end up being more benefits for the downstream user than directly back to the farmer. So it was a lot of hassle to overcome. So basically, kind of that risk reward ratio wasn't there. Even if we had 100% cost share on some of these practices, the farmer is still signing up for a 10-year maintenance agreement. So even if they had cost share up front, they're still on the hook for that practice for the next 10 years. Then there was early on, there was hassles working within the CRP program itself. You can't have federal funding on federal funding. So a lot of our grass filter strips were the CP21 program through FSA contracts. We tried to bring in NRCS funding and do it on top, and that wasn't working. We're kind of locked out once that filter strip's put in place into a CRP. But now CRP has included saturated buffers and bioreactors into their programming, so it is allowable, and you just have to fill out a few forms and we can make it work. If we had everything lined up, these smaller scale practices came at an opportunity cost for our contractors to actually do the installations. Early on, you get excited, like, oh, the saturated buffer is only $3,000, $4,000 to install. From watershed coordinator position, I thought, oh, that's great. We can put these out. They're very inexpensive, but to actually get the contractor to mobilize and take a couple days out of their schedule to install a practice, it's only $4,000. Comes at an opportunity cost to the contractor when they have bigger jobs to do. So it wasn't a very attractive thing. It kind of felt like most of the time contractors were just doing a favor to some of their landowner clients to go out and do these installs, and weren't really a high priority. Also, there's some tax issues. We get the cost share there for the farmer, they could get taxed on some of this cost share that they were receiving. So all this led to a lot of barriers. With the Polk County project, we thought, well, how can we address as many of these as possible? And I would say our biggest goal was we just wanted to create this economy of scale. I mean, we thought 25 sites would be a good bundle. We thought that'd be enough for a contractor to be interested in doing. We thought maybe we get our price to come down. We hit that 25 site number. We make it a priority for everybody involved, even the agencies that were doing the design, signing off on paperwork to make sure that this worked. We also had the right amount of funding to do 25 initially. To select where we're going to work, we did have the A conservation planning framework model run. And so we selected watersheds, and this ACPF tool said, yep, there's a high number of potential saturated buffer sites in this watershed. So we wanted to have, be able to have that conversation with the landowner, have quite a few landowners there. We had a direct outreach campaign, which I'll discuss a little bit later. But we actually mailed every landowner that had a hit for a saturated buffer that ACPF output. We mailed them directly and then followed up with a phone call to those landowners. We also thought, well, get that conversation going. Can we create more demand by incentivizing this participation? So not only did we get 100% cost share, we actually had a temporary construction easement that allowed us to have the public entity manage the contractor on private land. That temporary construction easement actually had a $1,000 payment to go along with it. We thought even with that $1,000 payment, we would save money on the long run, both through time spent on the project, and also by bundling these together, we'd be able to get a better price. And we also recruited landowners to install as many applicable sites that they had. So we had an interested landowner in the past, and we'd install one saturated buffer or one bioreactor with them and call it good. A lot of times you'd have a field day, and other farmers would come and look at the outlet and say, well, this is great, we put the saturated buffer here, but what about these 5 other outlets that I can see looking upstream? So we thought, well, if we have a farmer or landowner that's interested in the project and wants to work with us, let's check every outlet that they have. And if it works, meets the criteria that we're looking for, let's go ahead and put a saturated buffer on it. And then we utilize this fiscal agent model to be able to bundle these sites together. So this batch and build framework, we've kind of worked it out now into 8 steps on this. I won't go through all these, but we're actually trying to create a nice package where we can provide this framework to interested groups that are doing it. We're also going to be linking all the paperwork. So we have examples of copies of paperwork that we utilize in this Polk County project to make available to people. I think we're actually just going to step some Google Drive. So maybe if people are interested here, we can definitely do that and make that available. The planning, identify that area of focus. So it helps you if there's a watershed plan available that calls for these practices. That's very helpful in getting this going. If there's that ACPF output, I know Illinois is trying to get that together. The state, so I'm not sure how many watersheds in Illinois has it. Honestly, I don't think it's crucial to have that ACPF output. It's a nice starting point, but if it's not there, I wouldn't worry too much about it. Then having the conversations, with that local NRCS office to see what is their capacity to do design, let them know, hey, we're going to be doing this. You might get a lot of calls from landowners very, very soon. That's very important. The local soil water conservation districts in Iowa, actually, in our model, they held the maintenance agreements with this since it was a state-funded project, but having that local SWCD on board with it. And then also, in our case, the county itself, so County Public Works was the fiscal agent, having those conversations with that staff to see if they could manage, these bid processes or not. Those are all areas that we start when we talk about the planning stage. Having a local project coordinator, also very crucial to get these going. Kind of the point person that's on the ground that the farmers hopefully have a relationship before. It always works better. It's not absolutely necessary, but it does work better on that. Once we kind of get through that planning stage, we go to the outreach here, and I'll give ahead to what we did on our outreach. And I always joke, especially Steve in the room, this is very probably common for a salesperson to think about. But a lot of times I was a watershed, I worked in watersheds before I came on board with ADMC. We're very passive, it seems like, in selling our conservation a lot of times, hoping people show up to a field day. I always call it in Iowa, we have like death by field days. We get a new project, we get funding in place, and we spend a year and a half trying to find a site, and we invite farmers, hopefully show up that day, and then hopefully they sign up for that practice that we see. We do that over and over again, and we get some implementation, but nothing to scale yet. So we were like, you know what, we're not going to do a field day with this one. We're going to wait until we get these things done. If people want to come during the installs, that's great. We're not going to worry about a field day. We sent them on the left side of the screen, kind of a real brief flyer about what was in it for the landowner, a little bit of explanation on the practice itself. We didn't want to go overboard with that and scare anybody away. We also sent kind of a formal letter here And within that letter, we said there was a map. So we included a map of the fields that we were talking about. As farmers, are multiple fields. We want to know, let them know which fields we were actually interested in surveying. And then we also said within a few days, so actually it's about within 2 weeks of receiving this mailer, during a follow-up phone call from somebody on the project. And this worked very well because we'd call them, oh yeah, I got that letter. And either they read it or they didn't, but either way, they both kind of seen that they had that letter in place. Sometimes it worked out in their favor if they didn't read it because they feel a little guilty about it and maybe it's Iowa nice, I don't know, but they let you have that conversation with them. But that initial conversation with that landowner, usually just answer a few questions about these saturated buffers. And we just let them know that, hey, we're just looking to see if you have sites that might work. We get permission to come out to your field and do this initial survey. We're just going to mark your outlets, see what grade that tile main was laid at, and look at your soils. And for the most part, I would say we had about a 50% hit rate from the people that we got a hold of. Actually, like in the first round of this project, it was the COVID year 2020 is when we did all the outreach, and we hit that 25 cycle pretty quickly. We thought we ended up with 51 that got installed. But we still had landowners left to call actually that we caught this second year of the practice. Just continue on with this batch and build framework. We did that survey, do some initial designs. Once we had that initial designs done, came back to the landowner, had that preview with the landowner. This is where, if it wasn't a CRP filter strip program, you have the farmer or landowner sign a letter of intent to convert that to a CP21S, which is a saturated buffer, and that the county FSA could approve that then for them. But we'd have a preliminary design to just go over and discuss with them, like, hey, this is what it's going to look like. Are you still interested? There's always kind of that when we have people sign the dotted line, and it's always difficult. I know, at least in Iowa, once again, a lot of times they have to have that maintenance agreement signed until the practice is in place. So a farmer can back out to the very last minute a lot of times on some of these practices. Since we were bidding these things together, we knew we couldn't have a lot of farmers back out. If a contractor bid on 40 sites and all of a sudden 5 landowners pull out and he only has 15, that doesn't work with it. So we had to have them sign a little bit earlier on. Yep, then the enrollment and funding, that's kind of the big meeting. That's all right, we're serious, this is absolutely going to happen. It kind of feels like you're going to sign up a mortgage, but we tried to get as much of that paperwork done in little trips as possible. You can see all these different forms that we'd have the farmer or landowner sign. This was basically to give the rights to the fiscal agent to manage the contractor. This is actually when they would submit to get payment for that temporary construction easement. All the NRCS forms, updated conservation plans, get that signed. CRP1 if needed. We had to make sure they were the legal entity. Power of attorney form, we even ran into that with a lot of times there's a farm manager. In Iowa's Hertz farm management companies, they have the right to sign for NRCS practices, but to work with the fiscal agent, we had to have a new power of attorney form to say the landowners are right with the farm manager to sign this over. But we could get them through this paperwork stack, and that was kind of like one meeting. They didn't have to come to the office 4 or 5 times, and we found it worked pretty well. So getting back to our need for this fiscal agent, this is a pretty typical model in Iowa. The boxes at the top are kind of the funding agencies that farmers can go to in the watershed, receive payments. Landowners there, they'd have to have an agreement with each one of the different funding agencies, and they'd also have to go out and hire their own contractors. There might be one contractor doing this work, or there might be multiple contractors doing this work. The contractor would then have to invoice the landowner, pay it. The landowner had to go apply for reimbursement from the multiple funding agencies, which got really messy. Honestly, we can make that work if we're putting in, 3 to 5 practices a year, but if we're doing 50 like that, that's going to be a nightmare to try to manage. We did go with this fiscal agent approach, where the fiscal agent actually had agreements set up with all the funding agencies, then agreements with individual landowners to be able to install that practice. The landowner signed payments over to the fiscal agent, was going through an NRCS package. The fiscal agent created that one bid package, or we broke them out into 3 separate ones, but the same contractor got all 3 in our instance. And hire that contractor. The contractor liked it because in that agreement, he could bill back that fiscal agent every 2 weeks and get payment. So he wasn't sitting out on a lot of money for a long stretch of time. He could get paid as he went during the summer. The construction inspection just happened. It just went was happening as he was installing. It's just the results of the, you can see the concentration of outlets. So every green dot there is an outlet that got treated with a saturated buffer. This watershed, the red dots end up being bioreactors. We did promote saturated buffers first. Bioreactors, if a saturated buffer wouldn't work. Our ratios seem to be about 80% saturated buffers and 20% bioreactors these first couple of years. Results, and I mentioned these before, 40 saturated buffers, 11 bioreactors. We continued on this year, there's 80 sites going in this summer, 48 in Polk County, and we actually extended up to Story County, county to the north, the remaining 30. But this is starting to happen in other parts of the state of Iowa too, like I mentioned before. I think we'll probably be getting to like 200 to 300 of these sites going in every year. Just traditional expenses. Biggest takeaway here is IDOL's spending a lot on engineering on these practices. They do require a PE stamp, and that was really very cost prohibitive to projects going forward. How we stacked up, even with this temporary construction easement where we did pay $1,000 per outlet, that added expense, we still think we saved about $115,000. That's because that engineering expense comes down so significantly. I will caveat this with this first time we actually had an NRCS facilitated design for the first 51. This is using our engineering expenses for round 2 of the 80 sites. We actually had to go out to private engineering. Private engineering provided 50 of the site designs. The second round, previously we were spending just under $6,000 per design with private engineering in the state of Iowa, and now we had it bundling these together. We got $3,000 per site, so we saved 50% on that engineering cost, which is very significant. It's kind of like to go back, some people are very uneasy with 100% cost share to projects, but if we think about overall project costs, I still think we come out ahead. Oftentimes, 75-25% cost share model is very typical. If you look at that and compare the numbers, we're still about $20,000 cheaper than the Polk County model, and we only done like 75% of the cost share, even without that construction easement. So we still came out ahead. 50-50 cost share model, it did cost the public more money than the 50-50 cost share model, but I guarantee you we would have gotten 51 sites in 18 months, and also to get those 51 sites, it probably would have been 10 to 15 years of project work. So how much is the public actually spending on that project in the long run? Cost efficiencies, just some scenarios. So with drainage, it's hard to tell the exact watershed area of every outlet. We're actually very selective. We do just kind of a watershed map around each outlet. If it was under 20 acres, we wouldn't do it unless we could tie it together with another practice. We were able to eliminate sites. We actually surveyed 130 outlets this first time, and went forward with 51 installations. We were able to pick out outlets that we didn't think were cost effective or really warranted that investment. But looking at 20 to 40 acre ranges on these practices, and kind of some efficiency removal ratings. So 22% on the low end of the literature that's out there. 43% is about what we usually say for saturated buffers. You can see a very cost-effective practice, ranging anywhere, if you include the engineering expenses, $1.25 to $3.83 per pound of nitrogen removed. And actually, if you look at the literature, most of these practices don't include the engineering cost. They only include the installation cost on that. This is only projecting it out for 10 years because that's what our maintenance agreement was. Also, if you're somebody that looks at the literature, a lot of times they track it out over 40 years on these practices, and we're actually competitive over just 10 years, what other ones are tracked out for 40. Saturated buffers will work as long as they're out there. Bioreactors will have to replace those wood chips probably after 10 years. We'll take those engineering expenses out there under $1, $2.83. So we're very excited about that. There's that literature I was talking about showing removal efficiencies. Once again, these are for over 40-year periods, and ours is only over 10-year periods. So we were right in that ballpark with a 40-year estimate, only after 10. Cover crops are high. I will say when this publication came out, this was when there was some yield drag associated with cover crops on corn. So that's why the cover crop expense is up there. That number has come down now. Just major takeaways. think I'm almost right at my 30-minute mark, so I'm doing all right.
You're fine.
This direct outreach model really worked. I think it scares people to make those phone calls, or we convince ourselves it's going to take way too long to call everybody in the watershed or call these farmers. Honestly, I think it takes longer to plan a field day because we have how many meetings leading up to that field day. Printing out these maps and putting the letters together, it probably took 4 hours to do that, and then make the phone calls. We had 2 people, myself and the watershed coordinator, were making phone calls, and that probably took 2 8-hour days maybe after we had all the conversations and did the voicemails and called back. So it really wasn't that much time, and the effort really paid off. Now we do have other groups and partners coming into this. We have one of our co-ops. They have conservation agronomists. So now we kind of divvy it up, like, all right, who's the co-op's customers? You call them. A lot of times a watershed coordinator, if they have a history with a farmer or landowner, I let the watershed coordinator handle that phone call. And I kind of take all the cold calls, and there's no relationship prior with that landowner. And it seems to be working very well. The surveying, that's a significant time demand to do all the surveying. It takes an investment. You can't just go out there if you have the Maverick and truck and a GPS unit. Like it's still going to take you a long time. It really helps have side by side to get to those outlets. A nice GPS unit where you can store all that survey information for you instead of a laser level out there or something. That's not going to work. But getting your survey techniques down helps. We can do about 8 to 10 outlets in a day, maybe 12 on a really good day if they're all really close together. Just a lot of the coordination. There's more coordination. We're not used to projects like this. You're used to handling more one-offs. And so like kind of that database management of handling, oh, there's 130 outlets all of a sudden that we have to have all this information tracked for. It's really complicated. We have people like me making Excel spreadsheets. So a little database management goes a long ways. You kind of went with the mindset of, all right, let's treat every suitable outlet, but let's make this project big enough that people aren't going to say, no, we can't do it. Because we run into all these, the red tape that's out there, all the hurdles that we face. We just want to like, all right, FSA office, like you don't want to be the reason why 51 sites are going in your counties. Like, how do we actually make this work? And sometimes it's easier for people to say no than to say yes. But once we show them like, well, we got 50 on there. Like, how do we make this work? We want to make it right. We're going to follow all the steps that are needed, but we can do this. And it really helped. We had an experienced team, so we kind of knew when these roadblocks were potentially coming up. So we had those conversations before they happened. That seemed to work out really well. And the feedback that we've gotten from the landowners, they're all very happy with the way this program worked out. Their neighbors are doing it this year. The contractor seemed happy. He bid it again this year, so he's doing the 48 this year. So he got 51 last year, doing 48 this year. There's still some debate about how big these bundles should be, because that does take some contractors out of the equation if they're bidding on 50 sites versus maybe 10 to 15. You can probably include every contractor. Just that recipe for success, that local buy-in, watershed coordinator is very important. If you have multiple funding sources, that seems to really help. Dedicated project management, that's something that I think goes underutilized a lot of times in these, but kind of having that timeline built out, and you got to keep everybody on that timeline because all of a sudden you lose your installation windows. If something sits on somebody's desk for 2 weeks and they have to send it to somebody else and sits there for 2 weeks, then all of a sudden you're a month, 2 months behind. We have very narrow windows when these things can actually go in the ground. So being on top of that seemed to really help. Skip ahead. But yeah, with that, I guess I can field any questions anybody have. If you want to get a hold of me, my email information is there. Log on to our website. There will be a pop-up for our weekly e-newsletter. That only happens the first time you go to the website, but I encourage people to sign up for that. I like to send out information about, when there's time available for implementation, different policy things, different literature that's out there on these practices. Yeah, any questions?
You trying it on other practices like filter strips or right ams or anything like that, or just the set buffers right now?
We haven't yet. There's talks of them trying to with wetlands on it, and I think that's gonna be a little more difficult. These are kind of singular landowners usually, so they don't have multiple wetlands that come in, but you could do it with other practices for sure, but we just haven't yet.
When you're looking at penetrative buffers, you're actually looking at a CRP. And that makes it as a given. Easily to do that. Are you putting these on based upon size of the filter around here, the minimum size on the flat land is basically 36. They work on a 36 foot.
Yep, so 30 feet is the minimum in the standard, and actually, you have a 100-foot wide filter strip, it doesn't make any sense to put it 90 feet back. You actually, because you lose your grade to push the water out towards the stream. So if you keep it closer to the stream, you actually have more grade. Elevation difference basically from that stream table where that distribution line is. We actually move more water through the system, being a little bit closer.
Is there a relationship between the amount of flow going through and the actual load? I mean, I know there's load is part, the bottom line. Do you see greater load with high flow or low flow?
Definitely with high flow, it's basically what can the water transport. So, kind of moisture is that limiting factor most of the time. And I'm glad I talk a lot about bioreactors. I did a lot of work with bioreactors early in my career. We get really hung up on, all right, we got to treat 20% of that peak flow. It's like that right there makes the practices go on smaller mains, which means we're not carrying as much water on it. Like it's less cost effective next to that. Oh, we're putting on a main that only has 10 acres coming into it with a lower overall load because we want to hit this weird percent reduction number instead of pound number. And so, yeah, the kind of more water that you can get into that area and out of it, the better results you're going to have.
I see this as I said a nutrient loss reduction strategy here in Illinois. And if we're going to be regulated, which I truly believe that will happen, that this is our answer to the wet ditches that a lot of farms have as opposed to the dry ditch drainage system. And you're going to be writing permits. Every outlet, just like every municipality writes for every sewer system they have. This batching on a farm, for example, might allow you to have one permit for your farm versus 5 or 6 or 20 if you had that many outlets. I think this may be an opportunity, since you're batching groups together, and basically how many farmers would be in a batch, for example, the average?
I mean, if you wanted to get to 10 to 15 outlets, I'd probably 3 farmers maybe.
Okay. So then a farmer may, if he has 5 outlets, then he could possibly write one permit for all 5 outlets if he has one of these structures there, because he's actually set it up for a basic type of flow. I think that would facilitate the permitting process if we go that far.
Give them a brief geography of where Polk County is and why that's important.
Yeah, so Polk County is city of Des Moines in Polk County, and I forget to mention some of the most populous kind. Unfortunately, it's not on the drinking water watershed for the city of Des Moines. This first one wasn't, but the next ones are going to be in it. But Polk County has, the county itself had a lot of money, and they were interested in this project, and they were very crucial to make this go. They're more than willing to be the fiscal agent. They had a full-time employee that does the watershed work within Polk County, and so that's why they were interested in this. He actually came from that Polk SWCD before going over to the county. So he had experience with trying to sell these practices, kind of brought this idea to them, was able to make it go.
That Raccoon Creek.
Yeah, the Raccoon River would be the drinking water source for the city of Des Moines. This was then next watershed over, so it's not actually the drinking water source for the city of Des Moines.
What percentage of the land in Polk County is highly rural?
Probably not very much. So HEL ground, you're just getting off the low, so it's still mostly flat. It's actually pretty ideal topography too, these saturated buffers. We're not flat, pancake flat there, and it's flat enough that we have pattern tile systems, but then not a lot of surface intakes behind terraces and stuff. We have a little bit of relief coming into the buffer, which makes saturated buffer work better.
Probably the biggest highly rural area is that golf course down on the northeast side, trying to with 8. Right, I just probably about the most.
Any all balls?
Okay, any other questions? Well, Keegan, we greatly appreciate your time for coming in. Instead, it was just kind of a I was sitting at this presentation that first time and thinking about it, it's like, is there a way that we can